Launching a podcast is exciting. There's the initial idea, the planning, the first recordings, and the moment when the first episode is finally published. But something interesting happens after that first episode goes live. The real challenge of podcasting begins, because successful podcasts are rarely defined by their first episode. They are defined by what happens afterwards. They grow gradually. They evolve over time. They develop audiences through consistency and trust. Many podcasts begin with enthusiasm but struggle to continue beyond a handful of episodes. Others develop slowly but eventually become trusted platforms for ideas and conversations. The difference between those two outcomes usually comes down to one thing: thinking about podcasting as a long-term platform rather than a short-term project. In this final episode, we're going to explore what it takes to build a podcast that lasts. This is Podcasting That Works, a short series exploring how podcasts build influence, trust and meaningful audience connection. I'm Craig Burgess, founder of One Stop Podcasts. In the previous episodes, we explored why podcasting works, how organisations are using podcasting, and what makes a podcast great. In this final episode, we're going to explore how podcasts develop over time and what helps them become sustainable, long-term platforms. Podcasting as a long-term platform. One of the most important things to understand about podcasting is that success rarely happens overnight. Unlike some forms of social media content that can reach large audiences very quickly, podcasts tend to grow gradually. Audiences discover shows through recommendations, word of mouth, and consistent publishing. Listeners return because they enjoy the voice of the host, the quality of the conversation, and the reliability of the programme. This means podcasts often behave more like long-term media platforms than short-term marketing campaigns. A podcast becomes a space where ideas develop over time, a place where conversations build on previous episodes, a place where listeners gradually become familiar with the voice and perspective of the host. And as that relationship develops, the podcast becomes something much more valuable than simply another piece of content. It becomes a trusted channel for communication. Consistency builds audience trust. One of the most powerful factors in podcast growth is consistency. When a podcast publishes regularly, listeners begin to build habits around it. They might listen during their commute. They might listen during a weekly walk. They might listen while working or exercising. Over time, the podcast becomes part of their routine. Consistency also signals reliability. When listeners know that new episodes will appear regularly, they feel confident investing their attention in the show. This reliability helps build strong audience relationships. But consistency doesn't necessarily mean producing large volumes of content. Many successful podcasts publish every 2 weeks or once a month. What matters is that the schedule is clear and sustainable. Podcasting works best when it becomes part of a long-term rhythm rather than a short burst of activity. Developing a podcast identity. Another factor that helps podcasts grow over time is identity. Just like a brand or publication, a podcast gradually develops its own character. Listeners begin to recognise the tone of the show. They recognise the types of conversations it explores. They recognise the host's personality and perspective. And over time, the podcast develops a distinctive voice. This identity might be shaped by the types of guests featured on the show. It might come from the topics that are explored regularly. It might come from the storytelling style or the tone of the discussion. But when a podcast develops a clear identity, it becomes easier for listeners to understand what the show represents. That clarity helps audiences connect with the podcast more deeply. Audience growth and discovery. Another important part of building a podcast that lasts is audience discovery. Most podcasts grow through a combination of small factors rather than one dramatic moment. A listener might recommend the show to a friend. An episode might get shared on social media. A guest might introduce the podcast to their own audience. Over time, these small amounts of discovery accumulate. This gradual growth is often one of the strengths of podcasting, because the audience that develops tends to be genuinely interested in the ideas and conversations within the show. And that type of audience can be extremely loyal. Podcast listeners often stay connected with a show for months or even years. The future of podcasting. Podcasting continues to evolve as a medium. In recent years, we have seen several interesting developments. Video podcasting has become increasingly popular. Many podcasts now combine audio with visual recording for platforms like YouTube. Narrative and documentary-style podcasts are also becoming more sophisticated, drawing on techniques from radio storytelling and sound design. Educational podcasting is growing as schools and universities recognise the value of audio as a learning tool. Branded podcasts are also becoming more common as organisations explore new ways to communicate ideas and build audiences. All of these developments suggest that podcasting is continuing to mature as a medium. And as it evolves, the opportunities for creative storytelling and meaningful communication continue to expand. So when we think about building a podcast that lasts, several key ideas stand out. First, successful podcasts treat podcasting as a long-term platform rather than a short-term project. Second, consistency helps build audience habits and trust. Third, podcasts develop stronger connections when they establish a clear identity and voice. And finally, podcast audiences tend to grow gradually through discovery, recommendation, and meaningful engagement. When these elements come together, a podcast can become a powerful platform for ideas. That brings us to the end of this short series exploring how podcasting works. Across these episodes, we've explored why podcasting has become such an effective communication platform, how organisations are using podcasts in different contexts, what makes a podcast great, and how podcasts grow over time. If you're exploring podcasting for your organisation, brand or classroom, thoughtful design and production can make a significant difference to the success of the show. If you'd like to learn more about podcast development, strategy and production, you can visit onestoppodcast.com. Thanks for listening.